30 chairs. That was the entire congregation at Prince Philip's funeral in April 2021, and one of them held a woman who wasn't a Windsor at all. The press had a name for her, the Duke's mistress. Here's what that name hides. Her own husband, the Earl she married in 1979, wasn't in the chapel. She had buried a 5-year-old daughter. She'd spent decades being written about by people holding no documents, and the documents were about to be locked away for 90 years. And the story starts 8 weeks before her own wedding, with a bomb in an Irish harbour. Look at that guest list again, because it was published. COVID restrictions had cut the mourners at St George's Chapel down to 30 people, and every seat became a statement. The Queen sat alone. Her children were there, her grandchildren. Philip's German relatives, 3 of them, flown in under quarantine exemptions. And then, near the back of the arithmetic, one name that belonged to none of those categories: Penelope, Countess Mountbatten of Burma. She was the only person in that chapel who was not blood, not spouse, not sovereign. Buckingham Palace described her as a close friend of the Duke and left it there. Fleet Street did the rest, but the detail that actually matters is the one nobody put in a headline. Her husband, Norton Knatchbull, the 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma, grandson of the man Philip loved most in the world, was not on the list. Philip's mentor's grandson didn't get a chair. His mentor's grandson's wife did. That's not a love affair. That's a verdict. And to understand it, you have to go back to a summer morning in County Sligo, on a boat called the Shadow 5, when the family Penny was about to marry into was reduced by 4 people in about half a second. First, though, her. Before the earldom, before the Carriages, before the tabloids gave her a role in someone else's marriage, she was Penelope Eastwood, born in 1953, and her money did not come from land. It came from stake. Her father, Reginald Eastwood, was one of those post-war British businessmen who understood that the country was tired of rationing and wanted to eat something charred and expensive on a Saturday night. He built Angus steak houses. If you have ever walked through central London and seen those red-fronted restaurants clustered around theatres and stations, that was the Eastwood Empire, or its descendants. It made him seriously rich. It did not make him grand. That distinction matters, and in Britain in the 1970s it mattered enormously. Aristocratic families kept a mental ledger of where money came from, and money from restaurants sat somewhere below money from coal, which sat below money from land, which sat below money that had simply always existed. Penny Eastwood grew up on the right side of the balance sheet and the wrong side of the ledger. She had everything except standing. People who knew her in that period described someone striking, poised, reserved, and unusually good at reading a room. That last quality is the one to keep, not because it's flattering, but because 40 years later it turns out to be the single most useful skill anyone in this story possessed. She met Norton Knatchbull, Lord Romsey, in the mid-1970s. He was the heir to Broadlands, the Hampshire estate, and the grandson of Louis Mountbatten, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, last Viceroy of India, First Sea Lord, and more relevantly, the man who had steered Prince Philip's entire life. Mountbatten had helped engineer Philip's path toward Elizabeth in the 1940s. He had lobbied for the family name. He was Philip's uncle, his fixer, his surrogate father. He was also, by 1979, running one more dynastic project. He wanted his granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull, Norton's sister, to marry Prince Charles. He had been writing to Charles about it, encouraging the connection with the persistence of a man who genuinely believed families could be arranged like fleets. So consider what Penny Eastwood was walking into. Not simply a marriage, a house that functioned as an annex of the monarchy, run by a man who treated matchmaking as strategy, in a family where the Prince of Wales was expected at dinner and might soon be a brother-in-law. Was it love? Contemporaries said the couple were genuinely devoted, and there's no serious reason to doubt it. But nobody in that world pretended the two things were separable. She was beautiful and rich. He was titled and connected. It was a good trade in both directions, and everyone involved could count. They got engaged. The wedding was set for October 1979 at Romsey Abbey, the family church beside Broadlands. Then came August 27th. Mountbatten was on holiday at Classybourne Castle, as he was every summer, and that morning he took his wooden boat out from Mullaghmore Harbour to check lobster pots. The IRA had planted a radio-controlled bomb aboard the night before. It was detonated from the shore. Mountbatten was killed. So was Nicholas Knatchbull, Norton's 14-year-old brother. So was Paul Maxwell, a 15-year-old local boy working as a boatman. Doreen, Dowager Lady Brabourne, who was 83, died the following day. Norton's parents, John and Patricia Brabourne, were pulled from the water with catastrophic injuries. Nicholas's twin brother Timothy survived and would spend the rest of his life carrying that. Norton wasn't on the boat. Neither was Penny. That same day, in a coordinated attack at Warren Point, the IRA killed 18 British soldiers. It was the worst day the British Army had had in Northern Ireland since the conflict began. So the private catastrophe arrived wrapped inside a national one, which meant the family could not grieve quietly, even if they had wanted to. Philip's reaction is documented mainly through absence. He did what he always did. He went silent, and he kept moving. Charles, who had been closer to Mountbatten than to his own father in some respects, wrote in his journal about the loss in terms that were later published, calling it something like the last of a rare breed. Charles fell apart. Philip organised, and in the middle of that, the wedding was still on the calendar for 8 weeks later. They could have postponed. Every social convention supported postponement. They did not. On October 20th, 1979, Penelope Eastwood married Norton Knatchbull at Romsey Abbey, less than 2 months after her fiancé's grandfather and brother had been killed. The Queen came. Philip came. Prince Charles was best man. Norton's mother, Patricia, attended with the injuries still visible on her face. She had taken well over 100 stitches, and contemporary reports made a point of her presence, because that was the point. Understand what that wedding actually was. It was not a celebration. It was a demonstration. The IRA had tried to erase a family, and the family responded by staging the most public, most photographed, most royally attended event it could organise inside the shortest possible time frame. In the same county, in the same church, with the heir to the throne standing at the groom's shoulder. 8 weeks after a bombing, in a country under a genuine terrorist threat, with the Queen in the pews. It was proof of life conducted as a society wedding. Nobody asked the bride whether she wanted her marriage to serve that function. There's no record that she objected, and there's no record that she was consulted. What we know is that a 26-year-old woman from a steakhouse fortune walked up the aisle of Romsey Abbey into a family that had just been publicly attacked. And from that morning forward, her private life was national property. She had been in the family for about 8 weeks, and she'd already learned the operating rule. Appearances were not decoration. Appearances were defence. That is the beginning of something people would later mistake for coldness. The other thing that happened at that wedding is that Prince Philip, aged 58, took on a role he never formally announced and never explained. Mountbatten had been the connective tissue of that family, the one who arranged, advised, intervened, wrote letters, and made introductions. That role was now vacant. Philip did not fill it out of sentiment. He filled it the way he filled everything, by attaching himself to the practical business of keeping people functional. He had lost the person who had run his own life strategy. The Brabourne-Knatchbull family had lost its head, 2 members, and both parents to the injury lists. He knew that house. He had honeymooned in it, because that's where Penny was now going to live. Broadlands, in Hampshire, the white Palladian house with the lawns running down to the River Test. Elizabeth and Philip spent the first days of their honeymoon there in November 1947. Charles and Diana would spend part of theirs there in 1981. It was, in the emotional geography of the House of Windsor, the closest thing to a family home that didn't belong to the family. And by the time Penny became its mistress, it was open to paying visitors, because Mountbatten had opened it to the public in 1978, and because his death triggered a death duties problem that would shape the next 30 years of her domestic life, which is where the myth begins to come apart. Not in a bedroom, in an accounts ledger, a visitor turnstile, and a mother-in-law who would keep the earldom, and therefore the authority, for another 38 years. Death duties are not a romantic subject, but they ran Penny's life for 30 years, so we're going to spend a minute on them. When Mountbatten was killed, the tax bill on Broadlands landed on a family that had just lost 2 of its members and had 2 more in hospital. The estate's answer was the one every big English house was reaching for by then: sell tickets. Mountbatten had already opened Broadlands to the public in 1978, complete with an exhibition of his own career, the Viceroy's uniforms, the naval decorations, the photographs of India in 1947. After his murder, that exhibition became a shrine, and the shrine became a revenue stream. So the house Penny moved into as a bride had opening hours. Tourists walked through the rooms where Elizabeth and Philip had spent their honeymoon. Coaches came up the drive. Her home was, in a functional sense, a business with a gift shop attached, and part of her job was to make the business work. There was a second structure sitting on top of the first, and it's the one people consistently miss. Norton did not inherit the earldom in 1979. Mountbatten had no son, and the title passed by special remainder to his elder daughter. So Patricia became the second Countess Mountbatten of Burma. Norton was Lord Romsey, the heir. Penny was Lady Romsey. Patricia held that title until she died in June 2017. Do the arithmetic. Penny Eastwood married into that family at 26 and spent 38 years, her entire youth, her entire middle age, her whole life as a mother, as the wife of the man who was next. Mistress of the house, but not the Countess. Running Broadlands, but not owning the position. Her mother-in-law, a woman of real courage who had survived the boat and buried her son and gone straight back to public work, was also the woman whose title, authority, and precedence sat permanently above her. That's not villainy. It's just a system, and in that system Penny's standing was always provisional, which is worth remembering when people later described her as socially ambitious. She had married the future and been handed a very long wait. The children came, quickly. Nicholas in 1981, Alexandra in 1982, and in 1986, Leonora. Somewhere in those same years, Prince Philip taught her to drive a carriage. Here's the part the tabloid version never bothers with because it ruins the picture. Philip had given up polo in 1971, at 50, when his wrist gave out. He needed a competitive outlet, and he chose carriage driving, and he did not take it up as a hobby. He competed for Britain. He sat on the international governing body. He was personally involved in drafting and revising the FEI rules for the sport. He was, in a literal sense, one of the men who wrote the rulebook. He recruited people into it relentlessly, family and friends, anyone with the nerve. Penny took to it. She became a serious competitor in her own right, driving at Royal Windsor, at Sandringham, at the national events, for decades. That is not a cover story. That's a documented sporting career with results, stewards, timekeepers, and photographs. Now consider what carriage driving actually involves. Grooms, horses, trailers, a navigator on the back of the carriage, course officials, spectators standing in the mud with cameras. It is one of the least private activities available to a human being. The press decided it was a rendezvous. That was not really about Penny. Philip had been carrying an affair reputation since the 1950s, long before anyone in Fleet Street knew her name. In 1957, when he was away for months on the royal yacht and his private secretary, Michael Parker, was named in a divorce case, the rumours got loud enough that Buckingham Palace put out a formal denial. The statement said it was quite untrue that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke. Palace press officers do not issue denials about things nobody is saying. So the machinery already existed. It had been running for 25 years, and it needed input. She walked into it holding a set of reins. There is one honest quotation on the subject, and it came from Philip himself in 1992, when the journalist Fiammetta Rocco was writing about him. Asked about the affair stories, he said, in effect, how could he? He'd had a detective in his company since 1947. It's a bureaucratic answer rather than a moral one, and that's exactly why it's persuasive. He wasn't claiming virtue. He was pointing at the logistics. Take it for what it's worth. He also had every reason to say it. Then October 1991, and the story stops being about gossip. Leonora Knatchbull was diagnosed with cancer as a small child. She was treated. She died at 5 years old at Broadlands. In October 1991, her parents established the Leonora Children's Cancer Fund in her memory, and it raised money for children's oncology for years afterward. Penny worked on it publicly for the rest of her life. Every biographer who has written about Philip and Penny points to this period as the moment their friendship became something deeper. Giles Brandreth, who knew Philip and interviewed him repeatedly, describes Philip as one of the people who stood by her through it. Ingrid Seward's account runs the same way. Philip had a specific competence here, and it's a strange one to admire, but it was real. He was very good with catastrophe. He had lost his own family to exile, breakdown, and a plane crash. He did not offer comfort in words. He offered structure, activity, and company, and he kept showing up long after other people had returned to their own lives. But hold the chronology against the story, because the story is slightly wrong. The friendship did not begin with the child's death. The carriage driving came first by years. What the loss did was change the friendship's weight. It stopped being a shared sport and became the relationship in which she was allowed to be a bereaved mother rather than the wife of an heir. And the man in that role was her husband's cousin. Norton's own grief is not in dispute and should not be minimised. Two people lost the same daughter. What the record shows is that they did not get through it in the same room. Their marriage was reported to be under strain from the early 1990s onward, and by then the couple had another complication. Norton was one of Prince Charles's closest confidants, part of the small circle Charles leaned on as his own marriage collapsed. Accounts from Diana's side of that war held that the Romseys had taken Charles's part, and Diana's coolness toward them was well known in that world. Treat the specifics as contested, because they come from a period when everyone was briefing everyone. The structural fact is not contested. Penny's household was inside the Wales War, on the prince's side, and her husband's loyalty ran to the future king. So, why not leave? Look at what leaving would have cost in 1993 or 1996. 2 surviving children, both still young, a house that was a public attraction, an exhibition, and a family monument to a murdered man, a title she was still waiting for, a social world in which her only independent standing came from the family she'd married into, because the money behind her name came from steakhouses, and everybody in that world remembered it, and a press corps that had already decided she was sleeping with the Duke of Edinburgh. A separation would have been read as confirmation. She would not have escaped the story. She'd have become it. She stayed. And the odd thing, the genuinely counterintuitive thing, is that the family that supposedly should have frozen her out did the opposite. The Queen invited her, not tolerated, invited. Penny was a regular at Balmoral and Sandringham through the 1990s and 2000s, went to Royal Ascot, joined the royal shooting parties, was on the yacht, was in the photographs. Elizabeth II, a woman with an unmatched instinct for what would look wrong, put this woman aside the family calendar for 30 years. That is the single strongest piece of evidence against the affair story, and it's also the most ruthless, because the invitations did something else. They made Penny's position depend entirely on royal favour rather than on her marriage. Her welcome came from the Queen and the Duke, not from her husband. The 2000s looked from outside like repair. Norton and Penny appeared together. Their son and daughter grew up. When Norton's father, Lord Brabourne, died in September 2005, husband and wife stood together at the funeral, and the family closed ranks in the way that family always did. Alexandra and Nicholas were launched into adult life. The house survived its tax problems. Penny drove her horses. 26 years of marriage, 2 children buried and raised, a shrine to a murdered grandfather maintained, and a public performance sustained without a single interview from either of them. Then, in 2010, Norton Knatchbull moved out. He was 60. They had been married for 31 years. Handle what follows carefully, because almost all of it comes from newspapers rather than from either participant. The reporting said Norton had left Penny for Jeannie Ferguson, a woman who had been part of the same social circle for years. Neither Norton nor Penny confirmed anything, then or later. There was no divorce. There was no statement. Several papers subsequently reported a partial reconciliation, or at least a return to the same address, and the details of that vary depending on which reporter you trust. So here is what is solid. In 2010, the marriage was publicly reported to have broken down. It never legally ended. And for the following 15 years, the couple appeared together when the family required it and lived, by every credible account, largely separate lives. Now look at what that did to her. For 20 years, the press had been running a story in which Penny was the woman who took another woman's husband. In 2010, her own husband left, and the coverage barely paused. The headlines that mattered weren't about Norton at all. They were about what this meant for her friendship with Prince Philip, who was then 89. She had been recast instantly, from wife to available. The woman labelled a home wrecker had her home wrecked, and the press response was to speculate about her availability to a man in his 90th year. That's the nastiness the title promises, and it isn't sexual. It's that a bereaved mother, publicly abandoned, in a house that was a memorial to a bombing, got no version of herself in print except the one that sold. The palace's response is instructive. Nothing changed. She kept the invitations. She was at Sandringham, at Balmoral, at Windsor. In 2011, she was at the wedding of William and Catherine. When her daughter Alexandra married at Romsey Abbey in 2016, the same church where Penny had married in 1979, the Queen and Prince Philip both attended, and photographs from that day show Penny with them. Read those photographs properly. The Queen turning up to your daughter's wedding 6 years after your husband moved out is not a social courtesy. It's a public ruling on which member of that marriage the Crown intended to keep. Then Patricia died on the 13th of June, 2017, at 93. After 38 years, Norton became the 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma, and Penelope Eastwood, of the Angus Steakhouse fortune, the girl whose money came from restaurants, became Penelope, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, a title created for a viceroy, held by the woman whose husband had left her 7 years earlier, and which she now held precisely because she had not divorced him. She had waited 38 years for that position. She took it while living apart from the man who conferred it. Notice what she did not do. She did not sell a story. She did not authorize a friend to brief a sympathetic columnist. She did not write a memoir, and by 2017 the market for it would have been enormous. She had a genuine grievance, a documented humiliation, and an audience, and she used none of it. Instead, she did the thing she'd been doing since 1979. She stayed inside the frame and let other people fill in the caption. What she built in those years wasn't a public defence. It was a set of positions that couldn't be taken away by press coverage. The Children's Cancer Fund in Leonora's name, which she worked on for decades. Her own competitive record in carriage driving, which was hers and not her husband's. Involvement with the estate and with Romsey. And a place in the private royal calendar that came directly from the Queen. That last one is the strategic masterpiece, and I don't think she planned it. Her standing had migrated. It no longer rested on being Lady Romsey of Broadlands. It rested on being the person Elizabeth and Philip wanted in the room. Philip retired from public duties in August 2017, 2 months after Patricia's death, and moved his base to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a modest house, 5 bedrooms, no staff to speak of by royal standards. He spent his last years there reading, painting and receiving a very short list of visitors. The Queen came at weekends, his children came, and Penny came, repeatedly, over the 4 years he had left. They were still photographed driving a carriage together at Sandringham when he was in his late 90s. Those pictures were taken by long lens, sold, and captioned as a romance. What they actually show is a 97-year-old man who could no longer walk far, out in a carriage with the person he had taught the sport to 35 years earlier, near the end of his life. He died on April 9th, 2021, aged 99. And then came the funeral and the 30 chairs. Norton Knatchbull, 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma, grandson of the man who had shaped Philip's entire career, was not there. His wife was the sole guest at that funeral who was not a member of the royal family or a Windsor relation. Whether Norton was excluded, declined, or simply lost the arithmetic of 30 seats has never been explained by anyone with authority to explain it. What the guest list did is not in dispute. It made a public statement in the most watched televised event of that year about which of those 2 people Philip had counted as family. 5 months later, the last door closed. In September 2021, Sir Andrew Macfarlane, President of the Family Division of the High Court, ruled that Prince Philip's will would be sealed for 90 years. The hearing had been held in private. The press had not been told it was happening and had no opportunity to argue. Macfarlane's written judgment explained his reasoning: the need to protect the dignity of the sovereign and a convention going back to 1910 under which senior royal wills are sealed rather than probated publicly. The Guardian challenged the secrecy of the process. The seal stood. 90 years from 2021 is 2111. So the position is this: every document Philip might have left concerning his affairs, his bequests, his acknowledgements, locked. The Royal Archives at Windsor operate on access granted at the Crown's discretion, and private correspondence of that kind is not routinely released. Philip's own papers are not open. Penny has never given an interview about him, and there is no indication she ever will. What that means practically is that the sourcing for the affair story consists almost entirely of people at a distance. Sarah Bradford stated in her 1996 biography of the Queen that Philip had had affairs, Penny among the relationships discussed. Bradford was working from social contacts, not documents, and other biographers with better access reached the opposite conclusion. Sasha Abercorn, another woman long linked to Philip, addressed her own case directly and said it had been a relationship of the mind rather than a physical one, a qualified admission that also happens to undercut the whole architecture of the rumours. Philip's 1992 answer about the detective is the closest thing to a denial from the man himself. That's it. That's the evidentiary base. A contested biography, a friend's partial account, a bureaucratic brush-off, and 30 years of photographs of a woman holding reins, against which sits the record, the invitations from the Queen, the sealed will, the empty chair that should have been her husband's, and the fact that not one of the 3 people involved ever said a word. The public didn't get the documents. It got a screenplay. In 2022, the fifth season of The Crown dramatised the friendship, with Natasha McElhone playing Penny and the carriage driving used as the central image of an emotional attachment. Reports at the time said the family found it distressing. It doesn't matter now. That is the version that reached 100 million people, and it will outlive everyone who could correct it, because the correcting material is under seal until 2111. Norton died in 2025. Penny outlived him, still Countess Mountbatten of Burma, still silent. Go back to the chapel and the 30 chairs. The reason the myth was persuasive is that it required no work. A rich man's reputation, a beautiful woman 32 years younger, a shared sport nobody outside it understood, and photographs taken from 400 yards away. It gave people a story with a shape. What it excluded was everything that actually happened to her. A wedding held 8 weeks after a bombing because a wounded family needed to be photographed surviving. 38 years as the wife of the heir in someone else's title. A 5-year-old daughter buried at Broadlands. A husband who left in the full glare of the papers that had spent 20 years calling her someone else's mistress. And a friendship with an old man who had lost his own family young and was better at standing beside catastrophe than at almost anything else. She was never really one of them. The money was wrong, the name was wrong, and there was always someone senior holding the title. What she had instead was the skill people noticed in her at 23 and mistook for coldness. She watched, she measured the room, and she said nothing. It cost her 4 decades of her reputation. It also won her the last argument. Every person who wrote about that friendship had to guess, and she never once gave them anything to work with. 30 chairs at Windsor. She sat in one of them, in public, on camera, and gave the world exactly what she had given it since 1979. Nothing.